Dawn, March 5, 1945. The Belgian town of Hertgen lies in ruins. A cold mist clings to the shattered trees. Their branches snapped like bones after months of artillery fire. In the dim light, the cries of the wounded cut through the silence. Some German, some American. Yet behind the front lines, something remarkable unfolds. Trucks grind to a halt on muddy roads. Canvas flaps pulled back to reveal gleaming crates stamped with red crosses. Inside, stacked with mathematical precision, are endless bandages, morphine vials, plasma bottles, and surgical kits. In a world where men bleed faster than doctors can stitch, this sight seems impossible. German prisoners, pressed into stretcher-bearing duty, stare in disbelief. To them, it feels as if the Americans have opened a door to a secret arsenal of life itself. Bundesarchiv Eyewitness Report, March 1945. For the Wehrmacht, the contrast is jarring. Their own medical units are gaunt shadows of efficiency, stripped of morphine, sewing wounds with crude thread, and improvising transfusions with dangerous results. One nurse, her uniform stained from weeks of unwashed service, would later whisper in interrogation, "We could not understand. How could they always have more? Always another box, another bottle, another miracle." U.S. Strategic Interrogation Report, May 1945. The Germans had trained their soldiers to endure hardship, to fight on through infection and fever. But here was an enemy who defied battlefield attrition by denying it victory over their men's bodies. Where the Wehrmacht expected death, the Americans delivered survival. The year is 1945, but the roots of this disparity stretch far earlier. The United States Army Medical Department, transformed by lessons from World War I, had spent the interwar years building an infrastructure few could imagine. Massive depots in New Jersey and Chicago stocked millions of supplies. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Abbott Laboratories, and Becton Dickinson turned from civilian production to a relentless military rhythm, filling crates bound for Europe at industrial speed, Quartermaster Corps Report, 1944. By the time American forces stormed Normandy, every division was shadowed by mobile surgical hospitals, capable of setting up within hours, equipped with sterilizers, X-ray units, and refrigeration trucks humming with fresh plasma. The doctrine was clear. No soldier should die from lack of treatment if he could be reached. On the other side, the German medical service, though staffed with brilliant doctors and courageous nurses, was shackled by scarcity. Allied bombing campaigns shredded their supply chains. Factories producing drugs like sulfonamides were crippled. Trains carrying surgical equipment were diverted or destroyed. By 1944, the Reich had no morphine reserves left. Captured stocks were rationed with cruelty, with wounded men receiving half doses or nothing at all. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. German nurses on the eastern and western fronts grew accustomed to blood-soaked uniforms stiff with filth, reusing bandages until they turned brown and stiff. In such an environment, the sight of an American field hospital, with its shining sterilizers and endless shelves of gauze, felt like a hallucination. The doctrine mismatch was profound. The Wehrmacht, built on blitzkrieg, had emphasized rapid conquest, assuming wars would be short. Medical support was designed to patch and push soldiers back into battle quickly, not sustain endless campaigns. By contrast, the U.S. Army, prepared for global war, invested in depth and endurance. It trained tens of thousands of medics and corpsmen, drilled in battlefield triage and evacuation. Helicopters were not yet in service, but a vast network of jeeps, ambulances, and rail cars turned battlefields into arteries, feeding into ever deeper echelons of care. From the front-line aid station to the evacuation hospital miles behind, every link was designed with industrial precision. Field Manual 8-10, U.S. Army, 1942. The system could sustain pressure indefinitely, and the Germans, bleeding from attrition, began to realize that even in defeat, the Americans denied them the satisfaction of crippling the enemy through wounds. Numbers tell the story with cold clarity. By 1945, the U.S. had shipped over 13 million units of plasma overseas, enough to treat virtually every wounded soldier multiple times, Army Medical Statistics, 1945. Field hospitals carried inventories that dwarfed German divisional depots, thousands of morphine syrettes, hundreds of surgical knives, piles of fresh linen that seemed to regenerate overnight. The Red Ball Express, famous for hauling fuel and ammunition, also carried medical freight. guarded as fiercely as bullets. In contrast, a German field hospital near Aachen recorded in its logbook, "No more sulfur drugs." Wounds festering, amputations increased. Bundesarchiv Aachen Medical Unit, Nov 1944. The shock extended beyond the front. Captured German nurses described their astonishment at American medical orderlies who changed gloves between patients, who sterilized scalpels after every incision, who had separate wards for infection control. "We thought this was propaganda until we saw it ourselves," one nurse confessed. U.S. Army interrogation, March 1945. To the Americans, this was doctrine. To the Germans, it was science fiction. Survival rates reflected it. An American soldier wounded in Normandy had a 70% chance of returning alive if evacuated. For his German counterpart, the odds plummeted with every missing supply crate and every bombing raid that severed rail links. U.S. Surgeon General's Office. 1946. Commanders noticed the psychological impact. General Omar Bradley, in a private letter, remarked that the promise of rapid medical care sustains men in attack, knowing their blood will not be wasted if they fall. Bradley Papers, 1945. Conversely, German morale faltered when soldiers realized that wounds often meant not salvation, but gangrene, amputation, or a lingering death without morphine. To fight under such conditions was to march into despair, and the nurses who bore witness to this disparity carried scars as deep as the soldiers they tried to save. As the Western Front moved into Germany, the disparity grew more obvious. In the Ardennes, American field hospitals set up under canvas, operating through blizzards powered by gasoline generators, sterilizers hissing with steam. German medical stations, cut off and frozen, burned furniture for warmth and performed amputations with saws that had not been sharpened in months. The war had become not just a clash of armies, but a duel of systems. Industrial might versus scarcity, preparation versus improvisation. The very act of survival was industrialized by one side and improvised by the other. And so, on that misty March morning in Hürtgen, when German nurses glimpsed those endless American supplies, their disbelief was not born of ignorance but of contrast. They had lived in hunger and shortage, watched men die for want of a single vial of morphine, a clean bandage, a transfusion tube. To them, the American hospitals seemed like a cruel trick of fate, an empire of abundance dropped into a world of ash. They could not know the scale of factories in Detroit, the convoys across the Atlantic, the depots in England humming with assembly lines of gauze and glass. All they knew was that their enemy had mastered not only the art of killing, but the art of saving. Yet behind this abundance lay secrets still unknown to the enemy: the logistical web, the engineering marvels of refrigeration trucks, the industrial partnerships that made plasma flow like water to the front. For the Germans, this was a mystery. For the Americans, it was a weapon as decisive as any tank or bomber. The question remained: how exactly had the United States built a medical machine so vast that it seemed endless, even in the chaos of total war? The answer, and the revelation of the hidden advantage that shocked an empire, was about to unfold. April 15th, 1944. A canvas tent flaps in the English wind, its guy ropes straining as trucks unload crates marked with the bold red cross. Inside, lamps hiss with pressurized gas, illuminating stainless steel tables gleaming like mirrors in the gloom. A young medic checks the labels on glass bottles of plasma, shipped across the Atlantic at great expense. Each bottle has a story. Collected from civilian donors in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, separated into plasma and stored in refrigerated trucks built by engineers at General Electric. For the men awaiting D-Day, this was not luxury. It was life distilled into glass. Technical Manual TM 8710, 1943. This was the hidden advantage of the American war machine, a logistical and medical network so vast that it turned blood into a weapon of endurance. German intelligence officers, interrogating captured medics, were baffled by stories of plasma banks in Britain numbering in the millions of units. The Americans carry rivers of blood with them, one officer reported, his tone half in awe, half in despair. Wehrmacht Medical Service Report, June 1944. The Reich had no such reserves. Its wounded bled out on makeshift cots, while across the Channel, an army of surgeons rehearsed battlefield miracles with endless supplies. The secret was not only blood. It was organization. The U.S. Army deployed a tiered system: frontline aid stations, collecting companies, evacuation hospitals, and general hospitals far to the rear. Engineers designed collapsible operating tables, sterilizers powered by field generators, and X-ray trucks capable of rolling into muddy fields within hours of combat. Field Equipment Development Division, 1943. Factories in Detroit and Chicago, once dedicated to consumer refrigerators and radios, were redirected to produce mobile refrigeration units for plasma, portable generators for sterilization, and precision surgical tools. Germany had brilliant doctors, but lacked the machinery of abundance. Their evacuation system relied heavily on rail lines systematically torn apart by Allied bombers. Without reliable transport, even the best surgeons were useless when supplies never arrived. The Wehrmacht experimented with dried plasma, but production was so limited that entire divisions went without. Bundesarchiv Medical Trials, 1944. In contrast, American convoys landed at Normandy with crates of plasma stacked as high as ammunition, guarded with equal vigilance. "We protected the blood as if it were gold," recalled one quartermaster sergeant. U.S. Army Oral History Collection, 1946. The disparity became undeniable during one of the most grueling battles of the European War, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, September 1944 to February 1945. Fighting under the canopy of broken pines, both sides endured misery. Rain turned trenches into swamps, artillery chewed the earth into splintered craters, and frostbite gnawed at exposed flesh. American soldiers, when wounded, were rushed to aid stations within minutes. Medics trained under the new triage system applied morphine syrettes, sprinkled sulfur powder on wounds, and called in jeeps that ferried the injured to clearing stations. Within an hour, plasma flowed into veins, infection was checked, and surgery awaited. One after-action report noted, evacuation from point of injury to operating table averaged 47 minutes, U.S. Army after-action report. Hurtgen, 1945. For the Germans, the forest became a graveyard. Lacking morphine, nurses relied on crude barbiturates or simple alcohol. Wounds festered in the damp. Without sulfur drugs in sufficient supply, infections spread like wildfire. Soldiers who might have been saved with timely transfusion or antibiotics were lost to septicemia. German field hospitals, forced to retreat deeper into the woods, sometimes ran on candlelight, their scalpels washed in cold water, their bandages boiled and reused until they fell apart. Bundesarchiv, Medical Unit Diary, Oct. 1944. In composite testimonies after the war, German nurses described watching American hospitals with shock. They operated by electric light, with clean instruments, with fresh sheets. For us, such things were impossible. The Americans' technological edge extended even to the small details. Plasma was packed in insulated containers with dry ice, keeping it viable for days. Surgical gloves were issued in bulk, replaced after each patient, a level of hygiene unheard of in most German units by late 1944. Even anesthesia was industrialized. American hospitals had ether and sodium pentothal in quantities that seemed endless. German surgeons, in contrast, often amputated without anesthetics when supplies ran dry, their patients screaming through the sawing of bone. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Numbers again tell the tale. At Hurtgen, U.S. medical units processed nearly 40,000 casualties, keeping survival rates above 70%. German survival rates in the same forest hovered near 50% for serious wounds. Surgeon General's Statistical Review, 1945. The difference was not just in skill, it was in supply. A German divisional hospital might have 50 liters of plasma for an entire month. An American evacuation hospital carried 500 liters on arrival. A single U.S. hospital's morphine stock could outweigh that of an entire German corps. Factories back home were the unseen hand in this battle. In Brooklyn, Abbott Laboratories processed civilian blood donations into plasma, filling bottles day and night. In Detroit, General Motors produced not only tanks, but sterilization units designed for surgical tents. In New Jersey, Johnson & Johnson manufactured millions of sterile bandages, wrapped in waxed paper that kept them clean in the mud of Europe. Every riveter, chemist, and factory foreman became part of the battlefield equation. War Production Board Report, 1945. For every medic applying a bandage, there were thousands of workers ensuring he never ran out. The German reaction was one of disbelief and resentment. Captured reports from the Wehrmacht's medical inspectorate lamented that the Anglo-Americans appear inexhaustible in plasma and morphine. Our men despair when they see the care given to prisoners by American units. Wehrmacht Medical Inspectorate Report, Jan 1945. Even German wounded taken prisoner often survived because American doctors treated them with the same abundance they gave their own. For Axis nurses, forced to watch their soldiers die for lack of supplies, this was almost unbearable. The Hurtgen forest exemplified the hidden advantage, logistics as a weapon of healing. The battlefield did not just belong to tanks and guns, but to the invisible arteries of plasma shipments, morphine stocks, and sterilized instruments. American hospitals set up in hours could turn chaos into order. German units pinned by shortages sank deeper into despair. The difference was not only technical, it was spiritual. Soldiers fought harder when they believed survival was possible. Commanders noted that morale rose with the certainty of care. As one report bluntly stated, "A man who trusts his wounds will be treated, fights longer." U.S. Army Morale Survey, 1944. And so the mystery deepened. How could an army in the field maintain such endless rivers of supplies when war traditionally starved even the greatest empires of medicine? The answer was not found in hospitals alone, but in the machinery of supply lines, the convoys braving U-boat attacks, the Red Ball Express roaring through France, and the staggering weight of an industrial empire geared not only for destruction, but for salvation. What the German nurses saw as a miracle was, in truth, the deliberate design of a nation that had weaponized abundance. Yet the true scale of its impact was still unfolding, for these endless supplies would not only save lives, they would shatter enemy morale, reshape the psychology of war, and define how modern armies would fight long after 1945. Spring 1945. Across the ruined towns of Germany, as Allied columns pushed deeper into the Reich, the wounded staggered in from battlefields that looked more like moonscapes than farmlands. In the barns and cellars converted into German aid stations, nurses fought impossible odds. They lacked morphine, lacked sulfur, lacked even clean cloth. Bandages were cut from curtains. Disinfectant was improvised from spirits. Soldiers groaned, waiting for surgeons who had only crude saws and thread. Outside, artillery thundered, but inside the sound was worse. The rasp of untreated lungs, the whimper of infections spreading unchecked. And yet just miles away, American field hospitals stood like islands of light amid devastation. Lamps glowed from portable generators, sterilizers hissed, plasma bottles clinked in orderly rows. To the German medical staff who glimpsed them, the contrast was not just shocking, it was unbearable. Bundesarchiv Nurse Diary, April 1945. For the Americans, this abundance was not chance. It was the product of a strategy as deliberate as any campaign plan. The U.S. War Department understood that every wounded man saved was a soldier returned to morale, if not to battle. This was not only compassion, it was arithmetic. A division could suffer thousands of casualties in weeks, but if survival rates were doubled by medical support, its strength endured. For the Germans, attrition drained the Wehrmacht, not only through death in combat, but through death in hospitals that could not heal. The strategic effect was profound. By 1944-45, American forces could fight sustained campaigns without collapsing from attrition, while German units bled out in silence. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Psychology played a role just as vital as logistics. U.S. soldiers marched into combat, knowing that if they were hit, their chances of survival were high. This knowledge stiffened resolve. Soldiers wrote home about the miracle of plasma and the reassurance of medics always close behind. Soldier's Letter, 29th Infantry Division, DEC, 1944. German soldiers, by contrast, dreaded wounds as much as enemy fire. They knew that a bullet through the leg might mean amputation, infection, or death without pain relief. Nurses remembered how morale collapsed when word spread of shortages. They no longer feared the bullet, but what came after. German nurse interrogation, May 1945. In modern terms, medicine itself became a weapon of morale warfare. The industrial support that enabled this was staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, over 13 million pints of blood were donated by American civilians, processed into plasma by factories running day and night. Engineers at General Electric perfected mobile refrigeration that could operate in jungles, deserts, or the frozen forests of Belgium. Johnson & Johnson alone produced hundreds of millions of sterile dressings, their factories converting from consumer goods to endless streams of medical supplies. War Production Board Report 1945. Every assembly line worker, chemist and truck driver became part of the invisible front line. The war was not only fought by men with rifles, but by women sewing gauze, chemists stabilizing plasma, machinists forging surgical steel. German interrogations after the war revealed envy and despair. One Wehrmacht officer admitted that American abundance made our soldiers believe they could not win. Even wounded, the enemy rose again. Post-war interrogation report 1946. Nurses spoke of crying when they saw American hospitals treating German prisoners with more care than their own staff could give to comrades. This inversion of expectation, captors healing enemies better than friends could, was psychologically devastating. It eroded faith not only in victory, but in the system that had sent them to war. The strategic consequences rippled outward. Campaigns in Normandy, the Ardennes and the Rhineland might have broken American strength if wounds had bled armies white. Instead, the US medical machine returned tens of thousands of soldiers to duty, or at least kept them alive to see the war's end. German commanders noted with frustration that even heavy casualties did not cripple American divisions for long. They suffer, but they do not collapse, one report concluded grimly. Wehrmacht Situation Report, Feb. 1945. The ability to absorb punishment and return to the fight was as decisive as tanks or bombers. Beyond numbers and battles lay the human cost. Field hospitals were staffed by young doctors and nurses who had never imagined themselves in war zones. They worked through exhaustion, stitching, amputating, transfusing under fire. Corpsmen crawled through mud with aid kits strapped to their backs, pulling men out of shell holes, their red crosses shining in the gunfire. Their bravery often matched that of the combat troops they served. Many did not survive, targeted despite conventions. Their stretchers overturned by artillery. U.S. Army Medical Department Memorial Roll, 1945. The war's hidden heroes were those who turned chaos into survival, who weaponized compassion with the tools of industry. As the Reich fell, German nurses whispered what they had seen. Endless bandages, fresh sheets, plasma in quantities they could not dream of. They confessed disbelief that such things were possible in war. For them, shortages had become natural, suffering unavoidable. To see an enemy turn industry into healing was to confront not just defeat in battle, but defeat in imagination. The Americans had redefined what modern war meant. It was no longer enough to kill and destroy. To endure, one had to heal and preserve. The legacy stretched far beyond 1945. In Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and Iraq, the doctrine of rapid evacuation and abundant supply remained a cornerstone of American military power. The lessons of World War II, the rivers of plasma, the mobile surgical units, the logistics of healing became doctrine for NATO and modern armies worldwide. Today's network-centric warfare, with drones and satellites, still rests on the principle proven in Europe that survival multiplies combat power, and that logistics of care are as decisive as logistics of firepower. U.S. Army Medical Doctrine 1980. From field medics to modern medevac helicopters, the line traces back to those tents in Normandy, those trucks on the Red Ball Express, those bottles of plasma chilled by the hum of Detroit-built refrigeration. And yet, behind the triumph, the human cost remained immense. Over 400,000 Americans died in the war despite all the abundance. For every soldier saved, another slipped beyond reach. German nurses carried the guilt of watching men die for lack of what their enemies seemed to have in endless supply. For the survivors, the memory of those contrasts lingered. The smell of boiled bandages versus the crisp crackle of sterile wrapping. The empty morphine vial against the American crate stacked high like cordwood. In the end, the story of endless medical supplies was not only about victory, it was about possibility. It proved that war could be fought with an eye to saving as much as destroying, that logistics could sustain life as well as death. It left behind a lesson echoed by a US medic writing in 1945. Bullets win battles, but bandages win wars, Medic's Diary, April 1945, and so, the cinematic truth stands. In World War II, the United States unveiled not only the arsenal of democracy, but the arsenal of mercy. In doing so, it broke an enemy's spirit, saved countless lives, and rewrote the very fabric of modern warfare. For the German nurses who could not believe what they saw, it was a revelation etched in sorrow. For history, it was a turning point that proved the ultimate power of abundance. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor.